Hey guys, welcome back. I hope you're all doing well and that you all had a wonderful Thanksgiving if you celebrate. If not, I still hope that you had a wonderful November 25th. If you're new here, hi, my name is Jessica and welcome to my channel where I explore new true crime or creepy history topics each week, with the exception of last week. Last week I didn't talk about anybody. I was busy eating my body weight in Thanksgiving food. But the week before that, we talked about Brenda Schaefer and how 12 people in Kentucky almost let her murderer walk free. If you'd like to know how that whole mess played out, I will make sure to have the video linked up here in the card for you. Feel free to check it out when you're done here. And if you're just interested in true crime or the macabre in general, and you'd like to join me back here each week, go ahead and subscribe to my channel down below. I would love it if we could hit 1,000 subscribers before my 1-year YouTube anniversary in February, and we're only like 200 and some people away, so sorry, I'm done. With all that obligatory YouTube stuff out of the way, let's go ahead and get into today's story. Today, we're going to be talking about a man who's been dubbed the Brooklyn Body Snatcher. Yeah, shit very much is about to get weird, so buckle up. Michael Mastromarino was born on September 16th, 1963, in Brooklyn, New York, but beyond that, I really couldn't find much on his upbringing. However, I will say that given what I do know, it's easy to assume that he was brought up fairly well. He's described by those who knew him as confident and driven with an unquenchable thirst for success. He was someone who believed that if he worked hard enough, he could do anything that he set his mind to. He had the world at his fingertips. In all seriousness, though, Michael does seem to have been born with pretty much every possible desirable advantage one could ask for. He was handsome, intelligent, charismatic, athletic. He absolutely embodied the traditional total package. What's that old saying? Women wanted him and men wanted to be him, something like that? That was Michael. His life seemed perfect. That is, until a college football injury changed him forever. Michael severely injured his back and was unable to play following the incident even after he'd fully recovered. And while he still had more to his name than most, this did rob him of a pretty big part of his identity. However, Michael was not the type to get knocked down and stay there. Instead, he doubled down. He poured the energy that he'd been putting into sports back into his academics, which resulted in a pretty remarkable college career. His ultimate goal was to pursue some form of oral surgery, and it seemed like nothing could distract or derail him from that goal. Not even love. Despite the fact that Michael had his pick of the ladies, he only really ever dated casually. He was always pretty aloof with women because he had absolutely no intentions of settling down until he'd established himself as a respected surgeon. That is, until 1989, when Michael walked into a tanning salon and locked eyes with a young woman named Barbara Reifel. According to his cousin, Barbara was a 20 out of 10 in Michael's eyes, and she felt pretty much the same about him. She described him as her dream man, and in her own words, she was in awe of him. Michael and Barbara went on to very seriously date from that point on. They were madly in love, and they knew that they both wanted to pursue the good old-fashioned American dream together. Marriage, kids, white picket fence, that was their plan from really early on. And I mean, you can't really blame them. That was basically the benchmark of success until like 2010. However, they did loosely construct their dream around Michael's initial plan, waiting until he'd finished dental school to actually get married. They were finally married in 1992. They had a big traditional church wedding service where they were surrounded by like 9 million of their closest friends and family. Obviously, I'm kidding. I don't know their exact head count, but from pictures and videos I've seen, it looks like a relatively lavish affair, especially for 1992. Their life was shaping up to be everything they'd ever hoped for. They were blissfully happy, the envy of all their friends. Their life appeared perfect. Once they'd married, Barbara took on the role of homemaker while Michael went out and worked his way up the oral surgery ranks. He graduated from the NYU College of Dentistry and ultimately attained his goal of becoming a surgeon. Specifically, he'd niched down to cranio and maxillofacial plastic and reconstructive surgery. And he was very skilled at what he did. It did not take long for him to be recognized as one of the top surgeons in his field, an industry leader, if you will. He was quickly able to recruit 2 business partners, and together they established their own practice in Manhattan. And basically, in the blink of an eye, Michael Mastromarino went from making a comfortable salary to raking in millions. He and Barbara settled down in the affluent suburb of Fort Lee, New Jersey, and they welcomed 2 sons into their lives. Barbara gave birth to Michael Jr. in 1994 and Gerald in 1997. Now, it should go without saying that owning and operating your own surgical practice isn't exactly considered a part-time gig. So Michael did not have a lot of free time with his family. He worked long, grueling hours and often came home just physically and mentally exhausted. But despite this, Michael still did his very best to be involved with his children. He read to them, he played with them, he and Barbara took them on multiple vacations a year. Even though he wasn't home every minute of every day, he certainly tried his best to not be an absent father. Barbara has actually stated in interviews that at times she felt guilty for how perfectly her life seemed to be playing out. But we all know that no one's life is perfect, and things are very rarely as flawless as they seem. And they never are if they're ending up as the subject matter of one of my videos. The cracks in the Mastromarino's perfect life appeared gradually. Over the years, Michael slowly became more and more irritable and temperamental, and he also slowly seemed to be taking less and less care of himself. Once a man who took a lot of pride in how he looked and how people perceived him, Michael now often looked disheveled and unkempt. But while, yes, people did notice these changes, it seems to have happened so subtly that maybe it just seemed like the natural progression of life. You know, as you age, I'm sure it's natural to shift at least some of the emphasis you used to put into vanity into other parts of your life that now just seem more important. And I think that's what people thought was going on with Michael. Unfortunately, it wasn't. And it wouldn't be until February of 2000 that Michael's family would actually learn what was causing his slow downward spiral. Michael's parents were staying at he and Barbara's house for a while when one night Michael came home from a business meeting acting kind of weird. Eventually, later that same night, he locked himself in the bathroom for, longer than the average Tuesday. Long enough that his mom got worried about him. She knocked on the door and asked if he was all right, but eerily, she got no response. She then forced her way into the bathroom, where she discovered Michael passed out on the ground, covered in blood, with a needle in his arm. Literally one of a parent's worst nightmares. Shocked and appalled, she ran to get Barbara, and together the two rushed back to the bathroom and attempted to wake Michael up. But despite their combined efforts, they were unable to get much more than a few incoherent mumbles out of Michael before they helped him to bed, where he just passed out. Realizing that her husband wasn't going to be providing much of an explanation until at least the following morning, Barbara went searching for answers herself. She went back into the bathroom where, hidden in a small compartment at the bottom of Michael's toiletry bag, she found needles, bloody tissues, and 2 small glass bottles, one labeled Demerol and one labeled fentanyl. Like anyone in that situation, Barbara began immediately trying to justify what she'd just found. Obviously, her white-collar, successful surgeon husband was not a drug addict. He couldn't be. There had to be some sort of reasonable explanation. Then it dawned on her. His football injury from college. He'd had lingering issues from that ever since. He'd even received epidural steroid injections on numerous occasions to help ease the lasting pain. So that must be what he's using these medications for. Bingo. Nailed it. Nicely done, Barb. I'm sarcastic, yes, but I swear I'm not judging her for having faith in her husband. If I was in her shoes, I know I wouldn't believe what I was seeing either. And honestly, I'd probably force myself through a very similar thought process to try and explain it away. And when she was finally able to speak to Michael the next day about what had happened, he confirmed her assumptions right away. He explained that working as a surgeon on his feet all day, hunched over patients, exacerbated his back pain exponentially. So every now and again, he needed something to take the edge off. He apologized for scaring her, but assured her that he only resorted to the medications when his pain had become totally and completely unbearable. That he'd been in excruciating pain the night before, and that he'd, just taken too much. But that she didn't need to worry because he was a doctor and he knew what he was doing. Almost accidentally overdosed, but is a doctor and knows what he's doing. Make that make sense. But again, this was her husband, the father of her children, the love of her life, her dream man. He'd always taken care of her, and he'd never given her a reason to worry up until now, so she took his word for it. She trusted that he was in control of his pain and managing his medications, and she just tried to move past it. And although ignorance may be bliss, it's also often fleeting because the truth usually has a way of coming out. A few weeks later, as he was scheduled to be in surgery, operating on a patient, like the patient was already prepped and under anesthesia, Michael was found unconscious by one of his coworkers. He was passed out in the bathroom, pants around his ankles, needle in his arm. When his coworker finally got him to come to, Michael simply stood up, offering no explanation, and left the building. Honestly, thank God that's how it played out, because the alternative would have been him operating on this patient while he was completely drugged out. Horrifyingly, this wasn't the first time that something like this had happened. A few months earlier, Michael had actually fallen asleep during a surgery. Like he was standing over a patient, scalpel in hand, just asleep. One of his nurses had to wake him up to finish the procedure. And on a completely separate occasion, Michael, while presumed to be high, was operating on a patient and damaged a nerve in their face, which resulted in a permanent facial droop. Eventually, his business partners were forced to give him an ultimatum: either get help or forfeit his portion of the business. Unwilling to throw away everything he'd worked so hard for, Michael opted for the rehab option. And I use the word rehab lightly because it was basically an all-inclusive resort. It wasn't like he was locked away in some dark, dingy, windowless room devoid of all the joy and luxuries he'd ever known in life. His cousin referred to the facility he went to as the Ritz of rehab, so while I'm certainly not trying to lessen the difficulty I'm sure he was facing in getting clean, I am highlighting the fact that once again he was given every possible advantage to succeed, and he still refused to take it seriously. The program he enrolled in required a minimum stay of 3 weeks, and Michael stuck it out for 3 days. 72 hours. 15% of the bare minimum. Yeah, his inner elitist came out guns blazing when he entered this rehab program. He felt as though he was smarter and better than everyone there, including the doctors. So he packed up his stuff and he left. He assured everyone that he could handle his addiction on his own and that he didn't need to be cooped up in some rehab facility to do so. And while those closest to him had their doubts, no one really fought that hard to get him to stay or to go back. But Michael definitely wasn't fixed, and one night in 2002, when he didn't come home, Barbara got a really bad feeling about what he might be off doing. So she loaded her kids into the car and went out driving around aimlessly, just hoping to stumble upon her husband. And probably hoping even harder that he had some sort of reasonable explanation as to where he'd been and what he'd been doing. Unfortunately, things most certainly did not play out that way. Yeah, with her young children in the car, Barbara found her husband on the side of the road, handcuffed and surrounded by police. He was being arrested and charged with possession and distribution of cocaine and Demerol. And as if that wasn't heartbreaking enough, to add insult to injury, Michael had not been arrested alone. Conversely, he had been arrested with his mistress. Yikes. I mean, that's a really bad night for anyone. Despite everything, though, the lies, the deception, the humiliation, the drugs, Barbara still bailed him out of jail as soon as she possibly could. She's a better wife than me. If that's my husband, you're at least spending the night. You're gonna sit in there for a minute. You're gonna sit in there and you're gonna think about your actions. But after Michael begged and pleaded and agreed to go back to rehab and straighten up his act, she bailed him out. And he vowed from that moment on to dedicate himself to fixing his mistakes, to righting his wrongs and piecing his family back together. He started by following through on his promise to return to rehab, and this time he actually stayed for the full 3 weeks. And once he was released, he returned home and begged Barbara to take him back. He promised her yet again that he'd changed and that this time things would be different. He also promised that if she didn't take him back right then, that he would spend every waking moment of the rest of his life trying to get her to. And Barbara, moved by his pleas and determination, ultimately did agree to take him back and work on their relationship. Now, I know it's easy to sit back and pass judgment on her for this, or on anyone really who continues to give someone chance after chance after chance after they've seemingly proved that they aren't going to change. I'd be lying if I said my gut instinct wasn't to roll my eyes at this part of the story as well. I get it, but at the end of the day, I did not live what Barbara lived. I cannot imagine having to end my marriage, rip my family apart, and shun the love of my life. Especially not when he's sitting in front of me and begging to make everything right. I'd like to believe that I'd make the right choice, but in the moment, I can't imagine it being easy to discern what the right choice actually is. So try to show grace when it comes to your judgments on Barbara, or anyone else for that matter, who you may know who's going through something similar. It's easy to pass judgment from the outside, but I guarantee it is not easy to live through these scenarios and have to make these decisions. Sorry, I just always feel like I have to say stuff like this, not just to fend off people who may be feeling feisty behind their keyboard, but also to keep myself grounded and open-minded to what people may be going through. Anyways, back to the story. While Michael may have seemingly saved his marriage, he was far, far too late to save his career. Over the preceding years, he'd racked up multiple malpractice lawsuits, he'd openly struggled with addiction, and now he had these criminal charges plaguing him. All of these things eventually culminated to the suspension of Michael's dental license in 2002. Devastating as I'm sure that was. I mean, he'd worked his entire life to become a surgeon, so I can't imagine it was an easy pill to swallow. But Michael knew it was likely for the best. He knew he shouldn't be around an operating room because it would always be too close to his drugs and too reminiscent of his addiction. He needed to figure out a different career path, and fast. He'd built up a particularly lavish lifestyle that he and his family were now used to, and he needed to come up with a way to maintain it. Luckily for him, he had connections in tons of different industries that he'd formed during his time as a surgeon. Because of this, he knew that at this time in particular, the human tissue industry was exploding. The business seemed incredibly remunerative, with a ton of opportunity for growth. So, using those connections he'd made as a surgeon, Michael bounced around to a few different companies, learning everything he possibly could about the business, until he was finally able to acquire a license of his own to independently harvest tissue. After that, he created his own company called Biomedical Tissue Services, where Michael would harvest different tissues and materials from the recently deceased and sell them to biotech companies either for research purposes or for them to then sell to hospitals for surgical purposes, as in to be transplanted into patients. Honestly, in theory, the concept was great. Tissue donation can be used in tons of life-saving procedures. It can be used to treat severe burns, torn ligaments and tendons, and in repairing musculoskeletal structures like teeth or spinal components. It's pretty incredible when you start looking into it. Not to mention, it is a very lucrative industry. A fully utilized human can go for upwards of $150,000. It sounds kind of deranged when you break it down like that, but I mean, it's the medical industry. You hear medical shows use the phrase cadaver skin and you don't really think anything of it, but where do you think that's coming from? It's the buying and selling component that makes it sound icky. The assignment of a dollar amount to the tissues of a once living, breathing person. That's where it starts to feel dark. Which is why these organizations are supposed to be run as not-for-profit businesses. However, there's a pretty massive loophole where it comes to recovering costs. Basically, these businesses assign an amount to how much it costs for them to operate, and from there, they're able to recoup that amount. I don't know all the ins and outs, but NPR explained it like this. You can't sell body parts. The law is clear about that, but you can take what's considered a reasonable fee for your work. Unlike organ donation, where a heart or kidney goes straight from a donor to a recipient, tissue goes through many steps. Is tissue taken from the body at the hospital, a funeral home, or morgue? There's a facility fee. Is the body moved? There's a transportation fee. A procurement team takes the body parts? That's another fee. Bottom line is, with this plan, Michael seemed to have bounced back. He wasn't struggling with drugs anymore. He seemed to be building yet another incredibly successful business, and in the process, he could truly help people. He genuinely seemed to be happy and thriving again, and his life finally seemed to be getting back on track. But what you couldn't see from the outside looking in was just how difficult it was for him to keep his supply up with the demand. Michael's initial plan was to partner with funeral homes. He figured he could just easily harvest tissue directly out of their embalming rooms. He was easily able to get a few funeral home directors on board pretty quickly, but he mainly worked with a man named Joseph Maselli, who at the time operated the Daniel George Funeral Home in Brooklyn, New York. They worked out a business arrangement where Michael would provide him with $1,000 for every body he was able to supply him. Michael would then turn around and recoup many times what he'd initially paid Joseph for the bodies in the first place. The problem was that when Michael began approaching grieving families and asking to carve up their loved ones like a Christmas ham, they weren't about it. Like, 98% of the families that Michael met with declined his offer, which rendered his business pretty stagnant. But he couldn't throw in the towel. He knew that he stood to gain so much from making this business work, but more so, he knew just how much he stood to lose if he failed. Therefore, he couldn't just walk away. Instead, he adopted sort of a what they don't know won't hurt them mentality. Now, it's impossible to pinpoint exactly when his business may have crossed over to the dark side. Rather, it's believed to have happened pretty gradually. But over time, Michael began forging the consent paperwork needed to harvest materials from these people. Disturbingly, it was very easy for him to get away with. I mean, who's gonna tell? He hired Lee Cruscetta and Christopher Alderossi, whom he referred to as cutters. And together, over the next few years, they forged paperwork and harvested materials from over 1,000 bodies. To the tune of $4 million, mind you. What's really scary is that they likely would have continued to get away with this whole operation had the funeral home not switched owners. Yeah, once the funeral home came under new ownership, things started to unravel pretty quickly. Despite the fact that the new owner had kept Joseph Maselli on as an embalmer, she got an incredibly weird vibe from Joseph, and for reasons she really couldn't explain, she just didn't trust him. So one day she followed her gut and started kind of snooping around his embalming room. And when she touched the arm of one of the cadavers that was in the room, she knew immediately that something was very, very wrong. There was no support in the arm. It didn't feel like a human arm. It was squishy. Frantically, she began asking the other employees what exactly was going on, and pretty brazenly, they just admitted to her that they were in the process of harvesting bone and tissue from that cadaver, and that when they were done, they would replace the missing parts with PVC pipe and garbage in order to make the body presentable to be laid out for family. Understandably appalled, she took this information straight to police. In 2004, the Brooklyn police, as well as the district attorney, began formally investigating Michael and the funeral home. They began by contacting all of the companies that Michael had supplied tissue to and requesting all of their paperwork. Consent forms, death certificates, blood tests, you name it. If these companies had it on file about these bodies, they wanted it. And when they began to receive the documentation, they knew for sure they really were onto something. Because it appeared that every single document in front of them, every single consent form, supposedly filled out by hundreds of different families, had all been completed in one person's handwriting. So they began to backtrack. They contacted every family member they could find to determine if consent truly had been given for their loved ones' tissues to have been harvested, or if these consent forms truly had all been fabricated by one individual. And the general consensus from these families was absolutely not. No way, no how, over their own dead bodies would they have ever consented to this. Can you imagine? I cannot even begin to wrap my brain around how it would feel to find out that someone you had loved so dearly had been desecrated like that, so disrespectfully, by strangers with just so little regard to the person they once were or the life they'd once lived. I mean, it completely taints and tarnishes the memories that these people have of their loved ones. Now there will always be this horrible, terrible thing that happened attached to the memory of the person they once loved. I mean, it's sick. And as if that wasn't horrible enough, the consent forms weren't all that were faked. So were the blood tests that had to be passed in order to qualify someone for tissue donation. Meaning tissue was taken from incredibly elderly people who normally wouldn't qualify, as well as from people who died from cancer, hepatitis, HIV, and other serious illnesses or infections that, again, would normally disqualify them from donation. But Michael and his team didn't care. Their main objective was to harvest as much material from as many bodies as humanly possible. They followed basically none of the rules and regulations that are typically enforced in the human tissue harvesting industry. Michael and his team of cutters were able to strip a body of all its usable parts in about 30 minutes, a process which typically takes no less than 4 hours. Not to mention, Michael and his team would sometimes let these cadavers sit in unsanitary conditions at room temperature for days. But it was nearly the perfect crime. I mean, think about it. All of the evidence was going to be almost immediately cremated or buried. The chances of being caught seemed infinitesimal. So thank God the funeral home came under new ownership. Or who knows how many other families could have possibly been impacted by this black market human tissue enterprise. Michael was finally arrested on February 23, 2006, and charged with larceny, body stealing, and falsifying business records. Initially, he pled not guilty to these charges, maintaining his innocence and swearing that it must have all been his business partners, that he'd been none the wiser. But as bodies were exhumed and evidence continued to mount against him, Michael finally gave in. In 2008, he pled guilty to a multitude of charges, including enterprise corruption, reckless endangerment, abuse of a corpse, and body stealing. He was sentenced to 18 to 54 years in prison, but the damage he'd caused was far from over. First of all, this whole situation destroyed his family, financially and emotionally. Their reputation was completely tarnished. I mean, Barbara's husband and the boy's father had been headline news, dubbed a ghoul and the Brooklyn body snatcher. That's not something people forget. Barbara divorced Michael as fast as she possibly could, and she and her sons changed their last names to try and distance themselves from him, but honestly, it'll likely haunt them forever. And outside of his own personal relationships being destroyed, it's impossible to even begin to quantify just how many people may be affected from receiving tissues from Michael's illegal business. One patient for sure is known to have suffered an infection that turned into septic shock and eventually led to paralysis following her tissue transplant, and one 22-year-old even died 4 days after his procedure as a result of bacteria from the tissue transplanted into his body. And many are also believed to have developed hepatitis, syphilis, and HIV. So I think it's safe to say that the repercussions of Michael's actions will likely be seen for decades to come. 7 funeral home directors were also charged for and pled guilty to their involvement, as well as both of Michael's cutters. Michael served 5 years in prison at the Wendy Correctional Facility before he passed away on July 7th, 2013. He was 49 years old when he succumbed to complications from metastatic liver and bone cancer. Yes, it's ironic, and even he knew that. But despite his passing, his legacy has and will likely continue to outlive him. His crimes have inspired episodes of popular TV shows like Law & Order and CSI. So as horrifying as it is, apparently black market body snatching is a real captivating concept. Who'd have thought? Anyways, that about wraps us up for today. Let me know your thoughts on this case in the comments down below. As always, I thank you so much for taking the time to watch this video and to listen to this story. Before you head out, make sure you give this video a thumbs up. It only takes a second and it helps out the channel a lot, so thanks in advance. If you haven't already and you'd like to, go ahead and subscribe to my channel. I put out new true crime or creepy history content each week, and I'd love to see you back here in my next video. It's also probably not a bad idea to turn on your post notifications as well. I am not great at posting on the same day each week, so having that turned on will ensure that you don't miss the next time I upload. But until then, stay safe and have a good week. Bye, guys.